Let me ask you, how many people were here? This is our third meeting. How many people have been here before for our Resilience Cafe? Okay. How many were here for the first one? Okay. How many were here for the second one?
Oh, for the first one.
All right. And how many are here with us tonight? Are you all present? All right, good, good, good. Are there any families or any veterans here tonight? Okay, yeah? Okay, families of vets? Anybody active duty? No? Okay, so one of the things, of course, about our nonprofit, Steve's going to talk about it, is we deal with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. We've been doing it in our work for the last 43 years, but our nonprofit is more specifically for veterans and their families. Interestingly, as we've been passing out, I don't know if you all saw our posters around town. We have a lot of support in town. The stories have been opening up to us just as we pass them out to see how many families of vets that are out there and how alone they feel and isolated. So this was our opportunity to, and that's what we're doing here with Resilience Cafe. It's our opportunity to reach out to the community and not wait for everybody to come to us. We're busy enough, but we really want to do this. We feel that we love this community and we want to do it. We know there's been plenty of struggle and pain in the community for a long time, and people tend to get isolated or they just feel what we call stigma. They feel a little embarrassed, a little ashamed, and it doesn't mean it's anything rational, but that doesn't matter. Nonetheless, we have to find a way to overcome that so people can get rid of that barrier and reach out and make connections. And that's one of the reasons we're doing Resilience Cafe. By the way, there's usually a banner here that's a big banner. Do you see it?
Yeah, right there.
You do you? Then you need more than the Resilience Cafe tonight. John Crowley, who owns it, he got to put it up, but I told Steve I'm gonna post it just with words. But the Resilience Cafe is our way of reaching out and getting beyond the stigma, taking the clinical sting out of a lot of the pain that folks feel in the self-consciousness. We want to remove that, and we want to soften the message. And we don't want people to feel they're so isolated in the community and that there isn't anyone who cares. We do care. And this is going to be a forum. It's not psychotherapy, which is what we do, a specific kind of psychotherapy for trauma called Reiki and myofascial release therapy. We do a lot of family work. We've written a book, it came out about 6 months ago, called Trauma Healing, the Hidden Epidemic. And when I wrote it, even though it's for the entire country, really it was written for Petaluma and so many people that we care about in this community, and we wanted it to be readable. And we didn't want to put up any barriers clinically to get in the way of the message and help folks know there is hope and there is healing available. Anyway, let me give you a quick, wow, it came up. Okay, let me quickly go over a couple of things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Steve. The first session we talked about the types of trauma. Does anybody remember that at all? Has anybody read our book at all? It's a good book. You ought to read it. And it's you can get it in Copperfield's or Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble.
We're here tonight.
And we're here. Look at this. We've got a few here for us. Yeah. Anyway, we talked about the different types of trauma. Maybe, Steve, you want to?
Yeah, I want to.
Before I get into that, let him tell you a little bit about Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment, who's really endorsing and sponsoring this. He's our chairman, and let him just tell you.
Thank you for coming. A couple of bits of plumbing here. This event is sponsored by Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment, and we are asking for a donation, but it's certainly not mandatory. If you'd like to give a donation, I want to introduce you to Stacy. Raise your hand, Stacy. Stacy is our secretary. Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment is a 501c3 public charity. It was established 2 years ago to set up a trauma treatment facility in South County to handle severe cases of post-traumatic stress disorder which is oftentimes linked to traumatic brain injury, one of the signature wounds of the wars of the last decade. I'm a veteran. My dad was a disabled veteran. My son's in the service. So the plight and the concerns of veterans are very close to my heart. Dr. Bernstein was the spark plug behind Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment. He'd been seeing vets since they came back from the early stages of the Iraq War back in the early 2000s. Now, while the Veterans Administration is in fact the largest healthcare network in the world, it is extremely impacted. Still, with the 1.75 million living Vietnam-era vets, like myself, and the ultimately 2.2 million veterans that will come out of the current wars. In some parts of the country, the Veterans Administration is backlogged 2 years. The statistics of, for example, suicide figures for vets is approaching 30 a day. 30 veterans are killing themselves a day. An even more alarming statistic from my point of view has to do with active duty service people. 1 a day are killing themselves. And you'd think that that was a consequence of the wars, but over 50% of those who are suiciding did not see comment. Military service is inherently stressful.
Can you compare that to the public? Because my understanding is it's a much higher percentage than the public.
Well, the VA would have you believe that the suicide rates within the military are akin to the same demographic in public life. That's not true. I don't have the average statistics for suicide at my fingertips, but I still think it's alarming. My point is not to be an expert on suicide or statistics at this point, but to let you know that this event is sponsored by Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment, which exists to raise funds to create an acute post-traumatic stress emotional trauma facility in South County. We currently partner with Petaluma People's Service Center, which is the de facto deliveries of services for Sonoma County Health in this part of the world. Funds are tight for nonprofits. No money at this point comes to us from the Veterans Administration. So any donation that you can see fit to give would be greatly appreciated, and because we are a 501c3 public charity, it is tax deductible and you'll get a receipt. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Bernstein.
You can call me Peter around here. They do at the Institute too, so it's okay. Steve brought up some very important points, and that was a good question. We're talking about, what he's talking about is reported suicides. The number is much greater. We've treated survivors of suicide attempts that were deadly serious, and it's far beyond what the VA reports. There's a lot of suicide by motorcycle accidents, heavy drinking, drugs, suicide by cop, where, and I won't get into the details of that, but there are so many different forms that are not reported. So the numbers are much higher. We've dealt with veterans that are now out of the service that have shot themselves and wanted to die and they didn't. We've treated the after effects of that. There's a lot that goes into trauma, and I want to talk about a few things quickly. We've gone over it before, and we talk about it in our book quite a bit. It's the types of trauma. Most of the time, most people think of trauma as what they call shock trauma. Trauma, a traumatic event, some kind of disasters, dying, death, war, which is always traumatic. First responders and cops go through an awful lot of trauma. But those are the kind of things that most people think of when you hear trauma. That's only one type of trauma. There's another called complex behavioral developmental trauma. That's more based on very painful upbringings, abuse, abandonment, neglect, various things that you normally would have thought of in the world of psychotherapy and mental health. That's another form of trauma. They just never called it that. It has a very serious effect. Actually, in some ways, it's more damaging, and I say this want to say this generally because it's more damaging because it affects the person's development through their years. It distorts it.
More insidious, isn't it? Because where the other one's external and you can identify it, this is one that's wrapped in your identity, and you don't have any, you can't tell the public, well, I was.
Well, most of we call it the invisible hidden trauma. And the reason is when you see folks that have been really physically traumatized, there's no question you know it. You've seen them with amputations, you've seen them, their suffering is physical and it's overt, there's no question about it. They just can point to what their disability and traumatic event was and there's nobody that would doubt it. We're talking about emotional traumatization. That's what they call the invisible trauma. That's what we specialize in. The damage is far-reaching also, reaching out into our community, our families, caregivers, you name it. There's a lot of trauma in the community. Okay, so we're talking about developmental, complex developmental, we're talking about shock trauma. Then we're talking about another one called secondary traumatic stress. That's from people who treat or help people who are suffering from trauma. Families, neighbors, loved ones who are helping those that have been directly impacted by trauma. That's also, most of us who deal with, specialize in treating trauma will develop some form of secondary traumatization. We know how to deal with it at the Institute. We've had a contract with the 18 medical centers on the East Coast, the VA medical centers, on how to treat and themselves, how to help themselves and their teams. They're called combat crisis, what are they called?
I think you're right.
Combat crisis treatment teams, and we train them for a year. We had a contract. So they also are very traumatized, and there's some good people doing some hard work. So that's another type of trauma. Our specialty, I really think, has to do with what they call comorbid or co-occurring trauma. That's a combination of developmental trauma, shock trauma, more current events. Usually the folks that come to us with the very serious crises, always, I don't think it's too often that we see that there isn't comorbid or co-occurring trauma. That's a much more difficult, complex type of trauma. That's what we've been specializing in for many, many years. It affects the nervous system, the tuning in the nervous system. The trauma actually is not just in your head, affecting you psychologically. It's affected the stress responses in your more basic or autonomic responses, automatic part of your nervous system. And what happens is the trauma really embeds at the hyper-aroused state. So it's driven by a perpetual state of fear. When folks are stuck there, we have PTS, post-traumatic stress disorder. Our job is to not just deal with a person's psychology, but to deal with their physiology as well. Unless you deal with the body in some way, you're not going to heal trauma. We can certainly work on giving people perspective and counseling them, and that helps. But honestly speaking, unless you get to the body and know how to work with it and the pain that the body carries, you don't heal trauma. We've specialized in that for a long time. So we believe the work that we do with the body is very crucial to healing trauma. And for us, it's a difficult job, but it's also a very fulfilling job for us because we see people coming in horribly, in terrible, terrible shape, physically, emotionally, in their situations in life, and we see them improve, and we see what happens. It almost looks like they take a bath from the inside out because the stress levels are cleansed, call it whatever you want, discharged, diffused, and we reinstate what they call the self-regulation of the system, where they actually can decompress and get rid of that energy, that hyper-aroused state, and come to see life a little bit differently. We don't talk about symptomatic treatment. When folks that come to us that have trauma, we don't want to just treat their symptoms. We want to transform them. We want to help them get to the core of it and make it's almost like a metamorphosis. In other words, I know all you guys know the word, but basically we want to help them change their feeling state, their perceptions, the tuning in their nervous system, and their whole entire outlook on life begins to change. That's what we call resilience. Resilience is one of the characteristics that develops as you begin to heal trauma. And us, Resilience Cafe, we work on transforming. Actually, the word comes from a colleague of mine. His name's Peter Levine, and he wrote a good book. What did I call it? What's Peter's book? Waking the Tiger. And he's an old friend. We worked together for our PhDs many years ago, and he wrote a good book. And ours goes along with it. We feel ours is a really good book too. But Peter did the work. He talked about transformation of trauma and how to reach a healing and what it begins to look like as people heal. I like the idea how a perspective begins to change, and instead of us always looking at life fearfully, always expecting the worst in some way, getting what we call triggered, where some event goes off, and instead of our relating it in a natural way, our reactions are so overwhelmed that our perceptions, our reactions, everything that we do, our behaviors, are way off from current reality. Until you can get to the tuning that's been distorted, it's very hard to change that. I can counsel people all day long. Once they get triggered and this old physical reaction occurs, they can't hear me anyway. They can't hear anybody because the emotion is so powerful. Our job is to work with all of it. And as we see people heal, we don't have to be filling them with our brilliant insights. They begin to see it for themselves, which is a much more productive way of healing people. So life begins to look less fear-driven, less filled with anxiety, but it's driven by a new way of looking at life, even though we have difficulties in life, and there's challenges in life, as we all know. Well, the beauty of it is we don't have to overreact anymore. We see it for what it is, and we deal with it. And instead of coming from a fear-driven, anxious place, we come from a place of passion, spontaneity, resilience, courage, reinventing ourselves in some new ways that have to do with our present life, not basing it on our past and how things imprinted us in such serious and painful ways that we get stuck. We can really begin to relate to the present with hope. And it's a much nicer way of life, I assure you. That's one of the things that this is about. How do we reach folks in the community? How do we give them the message of hope and encouragement without doing psychotherapy in here, which we're not going to do? And even though we know our work that we call RMFR is very effective, we're not doing that here. But we do want to begin to have a forum where people can come and break down into small groups and begin to talk about some of the issues that they've been holding so dear to their heart, that have been so painful and burdening and distorting to their lives. At least we can get started that way. And then we can begin to identify some of the issues if they're really, really serious and distorting. There's the Bernstein Institute for Trauma Treatment. We do great work over there. We're not going to do that here, but there is hope. There are other modalities that also work very well, and they're great tools in dealing with trauma. And we encourage, I know there's therapists in the community and counselors that do some very nice things. I want to say this about this place and the way the way Resilience Cafe is set up. What we've discovered in working with trauma for many years, and I know that folks that are on the front lines at the VA, embedded folks in combat, first responders, peer counseling, peer counselors, folks that have been through difficulties themselves, are so effective in coming alongside someone who's suffering actively. And as long as those peer counselors are supervised, that's the key, and I'll tell you why in a minute, it can be more effective than, as much as I know, my whole presence, just being who I am, can be too threatening or overpowering. We want to take that sting out of the situation as well. There's been a lot of studies, and I don't even want to go into them all. I didn't like peer counseling for a long time. I see in this type of work, it's a good thing. The reason I say it has to be supervised is we have some very fine people that have great heart and compassion for the wounded folks that they can identify with. The problem is their compassion can get a little carried away, and they can begin to identify with the folks that they're trying to help. And all of a sudden they lose their perspective and contaminate the work, and their stuff is mixed in. That's not a good thing. there's been some real painful, tragic stories of veterans who've come back from war, and they have great heart for their brothers and sisters. And they don't have very good clinical discernment. And some of our true heroes, when they hear a family in distress, go right into it and go to help them, not realizing how clinically disturbed and dangerous some of these folks are. And some of our great heroes have been killed that way. Because they had the heart, the compassion, they identified with the pain, but they sure didn't have very good, they weren't thinking with good clinical common sense as well. So we believe the peer counseling with supervision is really a great model, and we'd like to encourage that here, and we do at the Aquas Cafe. It's a nice way to go. And we find that folks that have suffered and that have pain and have moved through their healing have a great impact on others that are suffering active. So we really encourage that. To us, that's one of the greatest prerequisites when we interview and hire clinicians at our institute. I'm not as interested in their degrees in schooling as I am in their backgrounds and where they are from their own trauma. So we really pay attention to that. Anyway, tonight's a little different, and I'm going to shift here, if you don't mind, to our administrator, Jenny Stevenson. As you have in front of you, we put out a newsletter, a trauma newsletter every month. And this one has to do with the holidays and post-rebound from the intensity of the holidays. And we've written this paper, some ideas on how to deal with it, and Jenny is going to speak on that a little bit. And she had some good ideas, and then we're going to have Wes over here. He's not paying attention. Wes is, he coordinates reintegration services. He's great with first responders. He's great with cops. He's great with military, because that was him. And he's retired because he got injured in a hostage negotiation that didn't go well. And now he's studying to be a psychologist, and he works with us, and he's a wonderful guy. I'm going to let him talk a little bit as well. Should we go to give Wes a crack and then let you go? Or? Okay. What? No.
Wes is volunteering Jenny.
No. This guy really has courage most of the time. And then put him, and he's a great
Sort of.
No, he's a great speaker. No, come here. Talk.
Wow, I just got thrown right in front of the microphone here. Just talk, okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Wes Easley. I am...
Oh, I just have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
For someone who's new to this, can you define what exactly it is that you mean by trauma? Or what, in terms of trauma and then post-traumatic stress, and what it is exactly that you guys deal with? I mean, just as a, just education, just educate me a little bit.
Just briefly catch
Ask
that
for a
question.
definition of trauma.
Yeah, definition of
post-traumatic
trauma,
disorder.
what happens at the institute,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
how you deal with that?
So, are you talking about post-traumatic stress or just trauma in general?
Oh, I was just wondering, say for instance, how does it manifest? Say for instance, for something who's been. Well, I had a stepbrother who was his Humvee blew up in Afghanistan or Iraq or what? Oh, anyway, I had a brother, a stepbrother who was in a Humvee, ended up in the Army, I think. I don't know the story too well, but I know that what I did hear was that his Humvee got hit by a rocket, and I guess it was, for some reason I can't remember. What's the war before Afghanistan? Was it the Iraqi? It was Iraq. Yeah, and he ended up, being discharged and but he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress as a result of it. And I think a lot of the people in the Humvee with him died. So, but he lived, and he's, anyway, I'm not in touch with him. I'm not aware of what his symptoms are, what has happened to him or anything. But I'm just curious about all of that.
Sure, it's a good question. Oh, wait, what's your name? First name?
Yosha.
Yosha. Okay, that's a good question. And obviously that was shock trauma. All war is shock trauma. This one was very serious, obviously. What happens, there's a lot of implications to this. Number one, the shock, let me tell you something, it's so overpowering that it's so beyond any of our coping mechanisms to feel that we're in control. No control at all. It's a life and death kind of experience. You're facing your last moments. And it throws us beyond our normal coping mechanisms for our nervous system, for our everything. It's so far beyond normal fear. It's terror. As courageous as your brother?
Stepbrother.
Okay, and there's a lot of courageous, Sean,
Yeah.
a lot of very courageous people out there that have gone through more than most of us could even imagine. They live with terror 24/7. In fact, one of my friends has written a book, and he's David Fair, and he's over at Fort Hood, and he calls it terrorist trauma syndrome. It's where the height of trauma and horror goes on 24/7. Either they see it, they experience it, they live through it. There is no let up. Where we go through it, there's a let up. These kids don't have any. This kind of situation, obviously, when we talk about trauma, it's affected him physically, emotionally, and every other way. If he lost all of his buddies, that's another element, and that's very dangerous. We've run into it. It's called survivor's guilt. And I think the kids that we've seen who come to us that lived through their attempts, they were haunted that they were still alive and their buddies weren't. And they couldn't understand why they didn't deserve to live, and they lost some of their best friends. So they come back. One of the folks that came, he was drinking a gallon of vodka a day the day he stepped on soil again. He was riding his motorcycle at 150 plus miles an hour by 2 Rock, and he wanted to die. Well, he crashed and he lived. He was in a coma, whatever. But what we saw, that was one of the more dramatic cases. We've seen many. He did not want to live anymore. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to be back with his friends. He had lost a lot of his buddies. And he really was carrying such tremendous, painful guilt that he couldn't see straight. And they had him medicated at the VA with like 10 different things. It really, he was like a zombie in some ways, and in other ways, we had one of the fire alarms, smoke alarms go off. He wanted to run out of the room. He was so distorted in his reactions that he was actually ready to, at any point, ready to relive the hyper-aroused state that he was in the battlefield. And it didn't apply anymore. As far as he was concerned, he lived there every day. He saw potential threats every day, wherever he was. We had kids that were heroes. They wouldn't even go to the gym to work out until everybody left at midnight. They wouldn't admit they were afraid, but they're living with such terror and always expecting danger or a rocket, potential at any minute. They're stuck. It's not just in their head, it's in their nervous system. That imprinted into their body. What happens is that imprint stays in their fascial muscle tissue. Their reactions, their real primitive reactions, they're on hyper alert, high energy at all times in that place, very anxious. They can numb out too, but that doesn't mean behind it they're not filled with anxiety and fear. And that's how they learn to cope, to disconnect while they're going through it. They come home. It's a different story. Everything begins to come to the surface. They carry it. They don't decompress. They don't lose that hypercharge, and they're fear-driven at all times. That's not normal. Even when you see a deer in a field and they see a predator, and their eyes bulge and the hair around their neck goes up, and they go into hyper alert. What happens though when the threat is gone, they shake off all that high energy. The hair lies down, the eyes off, and they go back to graze. We have that same tuning in a part of our nervous system, the more primitive part of our nervous system. We have it too. The problem is we also have a prefrontal cortex, the thinking part. We can override that. So we don't decompress anymore. We just stay stuck. Post-traumatic stress disorder is folks that stay stuck. Now they can come back and function. Many do. And all of a sudden, 4 years later, they'll be sitting in a room and they can't move, and they start sweating profusely, and they're shaking, and their family's looking at them, nothing's going on. And yet their reaction is so terribly strong. Their physiology takes them over, and they can't move. And they're back in the battle. They're back where the trauma is. They are not here. Now, it's not just in their head. You can say, wait a minute, you're safe, and I've said this many times. It's not happening now. Go tell their nervous system that. It doesn't work. Now, we go with a nervous system if we have the opportunity and soften that. decompress. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a person being stuck in another time in another place. Their responses and their reactions to the present are completely distorted. There's many different forms of it. That, of course, is a very dramatic type. And that's very current. That's why we do the Sonoma Coast trauma treatment to help folks like that. And we feel that it's very pressing. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of vets now that are suffering. But they have a lot of shame and embarrassment because they feel they should be stronger, more capable, more independent. And to show this vulnerability and fear is just absolutely unacceptable. It's not just military. It permeates our society too. So for us, we want to take that stigma out and say there's nothing to be ashamed of. I know you feel that way, but don't worry about it. We're here for you. And if I can't come alongside you because you can't relate to me, he can. Or he can because he's been in Iraq twice. And they're not going to act like clinicians. They understand they've been there too. That's peer counselors. And they're more acceptable many times than I am. I'm the expert, but I'm not the most acceptable. He is. So we look at any way to reach these folks with caring and love, and it starts with strength, by the way. You can't just sit there and say, oh, poor thing, and my heart goes out to you, and yada, yada, yada. That is not the way it works. If they sense that you're weak and vulnerable when they need strength, they hold you in contempt like that, and you're done. The latest kids coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan are touchy kids, or touchy folks. The Vietnam vets, the Gulf War vets are much more workable at this point. But if they sense that you have that strength, you have that experience, and you have that compassion and understanding, and if you have, and the tools to help them, they may be very receptive, and we hope they are. That's why we developed this nonprofit. And Steve was, by the way, a surgical tech in Vietnam era, and he still has PTSD to this day. Yes, sir.
Could I just say one more thing, Bruce? Sure. It's probably real brief. But I have a friend, Robert Permenter, who was M60 machine gunner in the Operation Kuwaiti Freedom in Iraq. And he suffered from, he's about my age. I'm 42, he's about my age. But he suffered from some pretty heavy duty stuff, really. Buried some friends. Killed some people. I don't know how many, but he's an M60 machine gunner in. But anyway, the interesting thing about Robert is that I met him through the theater up in Mendocino County, and he struggled with a lot of stuff. And a lot of the times, Robert would live sort of at this sort of a height of drama and intensity in just about everything he did in the community. So he sometimes would scare people. He's a big guy. And sometimes, I'll tell you, I think the thing about war is it takes you into a world that is so beyond that he got up into that level a lot in civilian life. And people thought, well, he's a lost soul, or he's so far gone from the war, there's no hope for him. The amazing thing about Robert is that Robert has become the most incredible fine artist painter in the world. I mean, not in the world, but really, he's incredibly good. A lot of his paintings deal with war themes, him burying friends, are just incredible. And I'll tell you, Robert has really, really transformed into the most grounded and clear. I'm just to look at his photographs is just, all you gotta do is look at the photographs to see what a testament.
We're going to break down into little groups, smaller groups for later, and I encourage you to share. Anyway, you can hear some of the things that people go through. Our community is filled with it. And it's not just war related. There's those that have lost loved ones. There's those dealing with grief and sickness. There's those dealing with the fallout from the recession to this day that are struggling plenty. And yet we hear, and Jenny's going to talk about this, you hear about how well things are going in the stock market, the home values are going way up, and yada, yada, yada. And yet many of us are still struggling plenty to make it day to day, to pay our bills. And there's a lot that's been tied up into that. I want to have Jenny talk about that. There's many forms of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. The recession, by the way, was very traumatic on millions of people. So many people lost their homes, their security, their jobs, their pensions. that was traumatic. So I'm moving along. I want to turn this over to Jenny because she's going to speak a little bit on the post-holiday, what we call a rebound, and let her go from there.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate one thing Peter said, which is that we've heard some dramatic things, and we know there are very dramatic things happening to people in our military, law enforcement around the world. But if you're here tonight, what's happening with you matters too. And so we're glad you're here, for whatever reason you came. Our topic tonight, and maybe there's a way you can kind of connect it up with your individual reason for being here, is how difficult times can be sometimes after the holidays are over. For people who have good family life, life is going well, after the holidays things can still be difficult because they're over and you have to kind of go back to everyday life, everyday struggles, and that close time is now over. For people for whom the holidays are not such a good time, maybe their families aren't as close as they'd really like, or they have not been able to enjoy the holidays this year because of things that they could not set aside to celebrate. The time afterwards is a time when people can tend to sink, kind of get into some despair and discouragement. And the idea that it's a new year and a new beginning starts to just sound like more than we can even comprehend. Like, how could a new year, okay, I haven't dealt with last year yet. I'm carrying so much. So tonight, what we would like to do is talk a little bit about not the list of resolutions and the pep talk. I'm not going to do that tonight.
What are you going to do?
Yes.
So, when you tie this with trauma, are those reactions normal, as much more exaggerated, intensified than first?
Sure, yes. That was, I didn't put it in quite those words, but what I was trying to get at was that for people who have unresolved trauma, lingering struggles, have to go back to real life rebound after the holidays is even more exaggerated. Having to deal with going back to financial struggles, relationship issues, losses, grief, just the everyday life can feel like, instead of you're just sort of going into a little more difficult time, it's maybe like you're going to go off a cliff. You can feel that dramatic. And so you come off the cliff and you don't really know what's next. You don't really know where you're going to go next. And so what we are suggesting is to combat some of that despair and discouragement and frustration is to keep in mind that we have options. That takes a deliberate choice and action, is to keep our perspective that there are always options to whatever it is we're struggling with. Often we almost kind of tie ourselves in knots around the problems, challenges that we have by going, I can't do that. Let's see, I could do that. No, I can't do that. No, that I can't do that. I'm just stuck here. And that is despair, defeat, discouragement. And that is not resilience. That is not moving forward. One thing Peter has said that I think is a dramatic and not a, he has a good way of putting clinical things in very easy to understand terms. And one of the things he said recently that stuck out for me is that healing is about moving forward. When you're stuck, you're not healing. So healing is about movement. How do you find a way to begin moving? Even if all you know is one little step forward, how can you start moving? So tonight, what we want to do when we break up into small groups is to have an opportunity to look at the ways that we feel discouraged about where we are right now, what challenges are facing us, where we feel stuck. Maybe start talking in the groups about what kind of options. See if people can help generate some options, help you generate some options for where you are right now, and get a little bit of a fresh perspective. That will be our small group exercise. And I'm going to be back to give some kind of basic ground rules on that, but I want to move on now so that I can give Wes a chance.
One thing I want to say, it takes a lot of courage. One of the things about healing that takes courage is you got to be willing to face yourself and look at yourself, honestly. And you got to look at the basics and how deep these things go and how they've controlled your life and how tight you're wrapped up into them. It takes, trauma can push you, it's a blessing in disguise many times. It can force you to take a look at these things, and somehow you know that if I don't, my life is going to be destroyed. It's just going to take every bit of vitality and energy from my life, and I don't want that anymore. If you've had it, you want to stop it. It means being willing to reach out, to speak up, and to go, I need some help. To be able to look at yourself and go, this hurts to see, but this is time for me to transform myself and change my life. Many times, traumatic events are the blessing in disguise that lead to life transformations. So these groups that we're setting up tonight, we have a little exercise, Jenny's going to tell you about it, but that's the beginning place. You don't have to do a lot of talking if you don't want to, just being part of it. Just listening to others, or it's a forum for others to be able to put out where they are. And we'd like to, this is a beginning step. It's not therapy. So I'd like you all to participate and think about looking at yourselves in a new way tonight and see what you need help with and what you need to work on. And be honest with yourselves. Even if it's painful, it will lead to some healing tonight. Anyway, let me give this over to Wes. See what he winds up with.
Okay. Thank you again. Again, my name is Wes Easley. I work as the law enforcement and military coordinator, the transition coordinator at the Bernstein Institute. Basically what I do is I work with both law enforcement and military service members who are in the process of transitioning from military into civilian life, because that's really where the problem that I've seen in my own life, as well as my partners, colleagues, is the transition. Because a lot of stuff doesn't translate equally from military life to civilian life. But with that being said, what I wanted to just briefly talk about for the tables exercise, just to kind of throw out some ideas to kind of stir your creative thoughts on what you might want to talk about once you guys do get into groups. And that's going to be the who, what, where, and when plan. This is for next year. But you can use it for anything, matter of fact. But I'm specifically talking about next year, next holiday season. The who, what, where, and when plan goes like this, simply. Who am I going to be inviting to my holiday season? Or who am I going to spend my holiday season with? And that's very important because, as we know, some family members really escalate the bar. And that's happened with me in my past. And then so we have the who, and then the what. What am I going to buy? What are we looking at? If finances are the issue, what I tried to do once I became retired, I had to work with a little less pay, so I had to come up with ideas as opposed to the grandiose gifts that my kids got so used to. I started doing things that were more arts and crafts, handmade, things that didn't cost an arm and a leg, where you have to keep escalating every year. My kids have a memory that just won't stop. It's like, oh, you got me that last year, so I need the next one next year. So we have the who, what, and then the when. When am I going to decide to get going on my plan for the holiday season? When am I going to decide to start buying stuff? I personally wait till the last minute. I procrastinate, and it bites me every time. So that's kind of something that I would suggest. Definitely get your shopping or whatever you're going to do, your plans, your rituals, get that started ahead of time as opposed to the last minute. So, yes,
Better check with Jenny. Did you have any other agenda for this time?
I'm just throwing ideas out, but because like I said, and it might not be something that I say, but that could trigger something else. But the idea is transitioning through the holidays, and kind of for me personally, it was lowering expectations at first. But then I started thinking, well, no, I can keep my expectations, but make it through the holiday season by planning properly. And so I had people that were there that I could talk to if the holidays started to go downhill or anything like that. So these are just some suggestions that I'm throwing out. With that, though, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Jenny. She's going to go ahead and talk about how we're going to organize the tables and who are the proctors going to be. Well, not proctors, but facilitators. All right. I appreciate you guys listening to me, and not throwing any items. Thank you very much. I will go ahead and turn it over to Jenny. You're very welcome.
You'll be here all week.
Oh, you're right.
So I'm looking at my watch. I want to leave enough time for this, and definitely, I don't want anyone to feel like they have to talk tonight. We do not have to talk. However, if you want to, this is a good opportunity. It does take a little courage. Okay, so let me just put out the ground rules. There are not many of them, but they're important. One of them is this is confidential. Please remember that what gets spoken here stays here. Respect that about people in your group. I would recommend that if you're, please, let people know what your first name is. You don't need to let people know what your last name is if you don't want to. The other is, please be mindful that everyone is allowed to, given some time to participate. The groups will be facilitated, and the person leading the group will kind of help shape the discussion. If what you're here for to get some help with tonight doesn't seem to you to quite fit into the questions, don't let that stop you. Just say, hey, here's what I came with tonight that I need some help with. I'm just going to put it out there. Do that. Okay, unless you don't feel like sharing, and then don't. Just listen, participate in whatever level you feel comfortable. So I'm just kind of scanning how many people are here tonight, and I think I would like to... Raising hands. Is everyone here in the room here for Resilience Cafe? If you're here for the cafe. Yeah, we're here for the cafe. That's great. Okay, I would like to create, I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say 5 groups. So, what I would like to do is, I would like to take you 7 people. I'm sorry, your name? Paige.